For 7 years, Carly Pierce Stevenson answered her phone. She sent messages home to her mother. Her bank account kept moving: fuel, groceries, cash withdrawals across 3 states. She had been dead the entire time. Her bones lay in a forest south of Sydney, nameless, cataloged only by a single word printed on the shirt found beside them. And 750 miles away, in a suitcase dumped at the edge of a highway, lay what was left of her 2-year-old daughter. No one was looking for them. Someone had made sure of that. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Alice Springs sits almost exactly in the middle of Australia, a town of about 25,000 people, surrounded by 900 miles of red desert in every direction. To get anywhere else, you drive for a full day or you fly. That geography shapes people. It makes some of them incurious and settled. It makes others desperate to see what exists beyond the ridgeline. Carly Jade Pierce Stevenson belonged to the second group. She was born in 1988 and raised in that town by her mother, Colleen, and her stepfather, Scott Povey. Family photographs from her teens show a slight girl with dark hair pulled back, a wide and slightly crooked smile, the kind of face that reads younger than the birth certificate. Those who knew her described someone soft-natured and easily led, quick to trust, quick to believe that a person offering help was simply a person offering help. It was not naivety exactly. It was a small-town instinct, formed in a place where you knew the names of the people at the next table. She left school without finishing. She drifted between casual jobs. Money was always tight, and by her late teens, she had begun moving between addresses, staying with friends, coming home again. Colleen worried about the pattern, but not about the person. Her daughter always came back. In June 2006, at 18, Carly gave birth to a girl. She named her Condolis Kiara Pierce. The relationship with the child's father did not last, and by the time Condolis was walking, Carly was raising her alone. What everyone around her agreed on, friends, neighbors, relatives who later spoke to police, was that motherhood changed her focus entirely. She was young, disorganized, chronically short of cash, and completely devoted. Condolis was blonde where her mother was dark, round-cheeked, loud, forward with strangers. She had just started stringing words into sentences. She had a habit of narrating whatever she saw out a car window. Colleen adored the child. She was a grandmother in the old style, practical affection, expressed through objects that took time to make. Somewhere in 2007 or 2008, she sat down and hand-sewed a quilt for Condolis. Patchwork, distinctive. Not a store-bought pattern, but her own arrangement, stitched panel by panel in the front room of a house in Alice Springs. She could not have known that this blanket would one day be the only thing in the country capable of returning her granddaughter's name to her. By the middle of 2008, Carly had decided to leave. The reasoning was ordinary. There was no work in Alice Springs that she could get with no qualifications and a toddler on her hip. Rent was high. The days were long. She talked about going east, New South Wales, maybe the coast, maybe somewhere she could put Condolis into daycare and find something steady. Her mother did not like the idea. It was 1,800 miles of highway, most of it empty, and Carly had no car and no money for airfares. But Carly was 20 years old and certain that the rest of her life was happening somewhere else. What she needed was a lift. In the last months of 2008, she found one. There was a man moving in and around the edges of her social circle, older, talkative, generous with lifts and cash and cigarettes. A man who had a vehicle and no particular reason to stay in one place. He was interested in her. He made himself useful. He offered exactly what she was short of. Colleen met him only briefly. She would spend the last 4 years of her life trying to work out what had happened after her daughter got into his car. The last time anyone in Carly's family saw her and Condolis alive was in late 2008 in Alice Springs. The two of them loaded into a vehicle headed for the eastern states. The man behind the wheel was Daniel James Holdom. Daniel James Holdom was born in 1974, which made him 34 when he met Carly, 14 years older than she was, and old enough that his interest in a 20-year-old should have registered as a warning to somebody. It did not. He was good at arriving in a way that felt like luck. He was a New South Wales man by origin, but by his 30s he had no fixed home worth the word. He moved. He worked when work presented itself and stopped when it did not. He had been in and out of relationships with women who tended to share a profile. Younger than him, financially precarious, isolated from family, carrying children from earlier partners. He was not charming in the polished sense. He was heavy-set, unremarkable, easy to overlook in a service station queue. What he had instead was availability. He turned up. He drove people places. He paid for things. To a young mother with no vehicle and no savings, that presentation is close to indistinguishable from kindness. Those who spent time around him described a different man underneath the helpfulness. Controlling about small things, quick to sulk, quicker to threaten, prone to constructing elaborate stories about himself and holding them long past the point of plausibility. He kept a partner named Hazel Passmore in his orbit for years, a woman who would later become one of the most important witnesses in the case, and who would receive an immunity arrangement in exchange for what she knew about what Holdom did afterward. His involvement with Carly was brief, weeks, not months. Prosecutors would eventually describe it as a relationship. In practice, it was closer to an attachment of convenience that Holdom converted into control at speed. The mechanism is not complicated, and it is worth naming plainly because it is the entire architecture of this case. He isolated her. Carly was already loosening her ties to Alice Springs. She had told her family she was leaving. She had told them not to worry. Holdom simply accelerated a separation she had already begun and then made himself the only fixed point in it. He had the car, he had the money, he knew the highways, and she did not. Once the town was behind them, everything Carly needed, food, fuel, a bed, a roadmap, a phone credit, came from one source, and she had Candace with her, which made her cautious rather than combative. A woman traveling alone can walk away from a bad situation at a truck stop. A woman with a toddler, no cash, and no return ticket cannot. They drove east through late 2008. There is no complete record of the route. What is known comes from bank transactions, mobile phone tower data reconstructed years later, and Holdom's own eventual admissions. A patchwork of service stations, cheap motels, and long stretches of highway through country where the next town is an hour away and nobody watches anybody. Carly kept in contact with home during this period. She called her mother. She sent messages. Nothing in them suggested fear. The tone was the tone of a young woman on an adventure that was going slightly less well than advertised. Short of money, tired, but fine. Colleen was reassured. Her daughter was traveling with someone who had a vehicle and seemed to be looking after them. By the beginning of December, they were in New South Wales. There is one detail from this stretch that investigators would return to again and again once they finally understood what they were looking at. Holdom took photographs. Not many people did in 2008 without a reason. This was before phones made images disposable. He used a camera and he kept the images, and he kept them for years afterward, through multiple moves and multiple relationships, without deleting them. Some of those photographs showed Candace, a blonde 2-year-old in bushland, alive, playing, unaware. Others would be taken later. The court would find that Holdom did not photograph Carly and her daughter out of sentiment or accident. He photographed them because the images were valuable to him, because he intended to keep something. On or around the 5th of December 2008, he turned off the Hume Highway, roughly 90 miles south of Sydney, onto an unsealed road, into a plantation of pine and eucalypt covering more than 8,000 acres. Belanglo State Forest. Belanglo is not wilderness. That is the first thing to understand about it. It is managed forest, commercial pine planted in rows, cut through by a grid of gravel fire trails, wide enough for a 2-wheel drive sedan. In summer, the air under the canopy holds the smell of resin and hot dust. Sound behaves strangely there. The plantation rows swallow it. A car door closing 40 yards away registers as almost nothing. You can drive into the middle of that forest and be, in every practical sense, alone on the continent. And you can drive back out in under 15 minutes and be on a national highway. That combination is why Holdom went there. He did not choose it at random. The court would later accept that this was a planned killing, not an argument that escalated. He had brought Carly hundreds of miles from anyone who knew her. He had a location selected. He had a camera with him. What happened in that forest was reconstructed from bone. Carly was subjected to a prolonged and violent sexual assault. Then she was killed. The skeletal evidence recovered years afterward showed fractures consistent with enormous force applied to the chest. The pattern produced when a person is stomped on or driven into the ground with a knee while lying on their back. Her throat was crushed. She was 20 years old, weighed under 110 pounds, and had no realistic capacity to resist a man of Holdom's size. Justice Robert Hume would eventually describe the killing as a crime of extreme gravity and appalling depravity, and would find that Holdom had violated her in a sadistic manner, treating her, in his words, as flesh whose life could be extinguished for his own pleasure. Then, Holdom did the thing that separates him from an ordinary killer. He photographed her body. He arranged the images deliberately. He kept them. The sentencing judge called them a vile trophy of his own inhumanity, evidence not of panic, but of a man who wanted a record of what he had done and expected to look at it again. He left her half naked among the pine litter, walked back to the car, and drove out of the forest. Condoleezza was in the vehicle. She was 2.5 years old. Her mother was gone, and she was in a car with a man she had known for a matter of weeks. For the next 4 days, Daniel Holdom drove around southern New South Wales with a toddler in the back seat. This is the part of the case that people find hardest to sit with, harder, in some ways, than the forest. Because it was not a moment of violence. It was 96 hours of ordinary logistics. Fuel stops, food, nappies. A child asking for her mother in a vocabulary of maybe 200 words, in a car with the windows down, in December heat. He was seen. People remembered a man traveling with a small blonde girl. He had a story ready, and he told it more than once. He was doing the family a favor, driving the child across to South Australia, taking her to her grandmother. It was a good lie. It explained everything. The absence of the mother, the direction of travel, why a man like him had a child like her. And it was close enough to something true that it would have survived a casual question at a petrol counter. Carly's mother did live interstate. Condoleezza did have a grandmother expecting to see her. He also kept photographing. Some of the images later recovered showed the little girl in bushland in the days after her mother's death, alive, standing, looking at the camera. He drove west. Somewhere in that journey, he passed through Narrandera, a town of about 4,000 people on the Murrumbidgee River, roughly 350 miles from Belanglo. Motel rooms there cost very little and require nothing but a name at the desk. The court found that Condoleezza was killed there, probably in one of those rooms. She was suffocated. Balls of dishcloth were forced into her mouth. Tape was wound in layers across her face, from the chin upward, over the eyes. A disposable nappy was wrapped around her head. Holdom accepted, in the agreed facts of his own case, that he had intended or planned to sexually assault her. She was 2. He put her body into a suitcase, a hard-sided case, the kind sold in every discount store in the country. Into it, he also put her clothing, small dresses, a tutu, shoes, and the quilt. The patchwork blanket her grandmother had sewn by hand in Alice Springs went into that suitcase with her. Holdom almost certainly gave it no thought at all. It was fabric. It was hers. It was in the car, and it needed to be gone. He was disposing of a life the way you clear out a vehicle before selling it. Nothing left behind that connects to the previous owner. That decision, made in some motel room by a man in a hurry. was the single mistake that eventually ended his freedom. But not for another 7 years. He kept driving west across the state line into South Australia. Roughly 750 miles from the forest where he had left Carly, he was on the Karoonda Highway, a 2-lane road through the Murray Mallee, flat scrub country of wheat paddocks and low mallee gum, where traffic runs light and the verges are wide and unmown. Near the settlement of Winarka, a place with a railway siding, a handful of houses, and not much else, he pulled over and put the suitcase into the long grass at the edge of the road. Then he drove away. He had now separated a mother and her daughter by 3 states and 1,100 kilometers of highway. Neither had identification on them. Neither had been reported missing because their family believed they were somewhere on the East Coast, settling in. 2 people had ceased to exist and nobody had noticed. For most killers, this is the end of the operation. You disappear the victims and then you disappear yourself. New town, new name, no contact with anything connected to the crime. Holdom did the opposite. He still had Carly's mobile phone. He still had her bank card. He knew her PIN, her date of birth, her mother's name, the names of her friends. He had, in effect, inherited an identity that no one had any reason to suspect was vacant. And over the next several years, he used it. The messages started almost immediately. Carly's phone kept working, it kept receiving, and it kept replying. Short texts to her mother, her stepfather, her friends. She was fine, she was busy, Condolis was good, money was tight. She would call when she could. The phrasing was vague enough to survive scrutiny and warm enough to close the conversation. Colleen Povey read them in Alice Springs and had no reason on earth to doubt them. Her daughter had always been an unreliable correspondent. Long silences followed by a burst of contact was the normal rhythm of their relationship. The account kept moving too. Carly was receiving government payments, the standard support available to a single mother in Australia. Those payments did not stop when she died because nobody had told anyone she was dead. They accumulated, they were drawn down. Over the years that followed, roughly $72,000 was taken from accounts belonging to a woman lying in a pine plantation in New South Wales. The withdrawals were made across state lines, in ordinary towns, at ordinary counters, by people presenting the right details. Holdom did not do all of this alone. Hazel Passmore, the woman who had orbited him for years, participated in the exploitation of Carly's identity and would eventually be granted immunity in exchange for testifying about it. Some of the money went on nothing memorable: fuel, rent, shopping. That is the detail that stays with people afterward. 2 lives were converted into a slow trickle of household expenses. In 2009, Colleen's patience finally broke. The messages had become thinner. The calls had stopped. She had not heard her daughter's actual voice in months, and she had never once heard her granddaughter in the background. She went to police in the Northern Territory and reported Carly and Condolis missing. A file was opened, and then a text message arrived. It came from Carly's number. It said, in substance, that she was fine, that she was living her own life, that she did not want to be chased, that everyone should stop. Police did what police do with an adult who has apparently chosen to cut contact and has confirmed it in writing. The report was withdrawn, the file closed. Holdom had killed both of them, disposed of them 1,000 kilometers apart, and then, from the safety of a keypad, shut down the only official search that was ever going to be launched for them. Colleen accepted it because the alternative was unbearable. Her daughter was angry with her. That was survivable. That meant she was alive. Understand what this did to a family over the following 3 years. There was no grieving because there was no death. There was no anger because there was no crime. There was only a slow, corrosive confusion. Birthdays that passed without a call. Christmases where the phone stayed quiet. A grandmother buying gifts for a child she could not post them to. Relatives began to build private theories. Carly had fallen in with a bad crowd. Carly was ashamed of something. Carly was punishing them. The rumors spread outward through Alice Springs the way they do in towns that size. Not as scandal, but as a kind of settled background fact. That girl who left never came back, doesn't speak to her mom. A community had quietly decided that a murdered 20-year-old was simply a bad daughter. In 2011, Colleen was diagnosed with cancer. She spent what time she had left doing the only thing available to her, asking, calling the number, asking friends of friends whether anyone had seen them on the coast. Telling anyone who would listen that Carly would turn up. She died in 2012. Her husband, Scott Povey, was holding her hand at the end. He would later describe in a courtroom in Sydney what her last coherent sentence had been. A few hours before she stopped breathing, she asked whether Carly and Condolis had arrived yet. He said that in that moment, he knew they were not coming. Colleen Povey was buried without ever learning that her daughter had been dead for 4 years, that her granddaughter had been dead for 4 years and 4 days, or that the quilt she had stitched by hand was lying in a suitcase in the grass beside a South Australian highway, 1,300 miles from her front door, waiting to say the thing she had spent the rest of her life trying to find out. On 29th August 2010, 2 trail bike riders came off a fire trail in Belanglo State Forest and stopped where the pine gave way to scrub. There were bones in the leaf litter, not buried, not concealed under rock or timber, scattered across a small area by 20 months of weather and animals, bleached where the sun reached them, dark where they had lain in the mulch. A skull, ribs, the long bones of the legs, some of them yards apart. The riders backed away and called it in, and within hours the forest was closed and a forensic team was working the site on hands and knees. What they recovered was almost nothing. A woman, young. The growth plates put her somewhere between 18 and 30. Small, around 5'2", no wallet, no keys, no phone, no jewelry, no dental work distinctive enough to match to a chart, not enough soft tissue left to determine a cause of death by ordinary means, only what the skeleton itself could say. Massive blunt force to the chest, and damage consistent with a crushed throat. There was clothing nearby, ordinary clothing, cheap, mass-produced. And on one item, there was a printed word, angelic. Police had no name to attach to her, and a case needs a name. When they went public asking for help, they called her Angel. The press shortened it. She became the Angel of Belanglo, and that was the only identity she had for the next 5 years. The investigation went wrong immediately, and not through incompetence. Belanglo carried a reputation. Bodies had come out of that forest before, in the early 90s, in a case that had been front-page news across the country. The moment skeletal remains surfaced under those pines again, every reporter in New South Wales reached the same conclusion, and the theory dominated coverage for weeks. Forensic analysis dismantled it. The condition of the remains and the state of the surrounding ground indicated the body had been left there long after the man responsible for those earlier crimes was already serving life. Whoever this woman was, she had died recently, within the previous 2 or 3 years. But by then, the assumption had done its damage. Public attention had locked onto a story that was closed, and the actual question, who is she, got very little oxygen. The second theory was more reasonable and just as wrong. Belanglo sits beside the Hume Highway. Young women who go missing near major intercity routes are, statistically, often travelers. Investigators worked the assumption that she was a backpacker or a hitchhiker, possibly foreign, possibly someone whose absence would be noticed slowly or noticed overseas. They ran her against missing persons databases in Australia and abroad. Nothing matched. And it could not match because the reason she was not on any list was not that she was foreign or transient. It was that a text message sent from her own phone had persuaded police in another jurisdiction to close her file 18 months earlier. Every search assumed a family somewhere was looking. Her family had been told to stop. In 2011, forensic artists produced a facial reconstruction, a clay and computer approximation built up from the contours of the skull. Police released it nationally. A young woman with dark hair, neutral expression, the slightly unreal quality that reconstructions always carry. It generated calls, none of them led anywhere. Nobody in Alice Springs saw it, or, if they did not connect a stranger's approximated face with a girl who had chosen to stop speaking to her mother. By 2012, the file was cold. By 2013, it was one more unidentified remains case in a country that has hundreds of them. The forest reopened. The trail bikes came back. She stayed on a shelf in a box, cataloged under a word from a t-shirt. 5 years passed, and roughly 750 miles west, in the grass beside a highway in the South Australian Mallee, a suitcase sat through 5 summers and 5 winters. The sun rotting the fabric, the seams splitting, the case slowly collapsing in on what it held, until a driver slowed down to look at it. 15th of July, 2015, midwinter in South Australia. The Cruelty Highway runs east out of the Adelaide Hills into flat, pale country. Wheat stubble, low Mallee scrub, fence lines, sky. A motorist heading through Winnerka noticed something in the grass on the verge. A suitcase, hard-shelled, weathered, half swallowed by the roadside vegetation. People stop for roadside dumping all the time. Occasionally, it is something worth taking. He got out and opened it. Inside were children's clothes, small dresses, a tutu, shoes sized for a toddler. And among the fabric, brittle and browned, were bones. He called the police, and by that afternoon, a section of the Cruelty Highway was closed and tented. The remains belonged to a girl, very young. The skeleton suggested somewhere between 2 and 4 years old. And she had been in that suitcase a long time, not months, years. Investigators concluded almost immediately that she had suffered a violent death well before her body was placed at the roadside. What was still on her told them how. Compacted balls of dishcloth in the mouth, layers of tape wound around the skull, running from beneath the chin up over the eye sockets, a disposable nappy wrapped around the head. Whoever she was, she had not died of neglect or illness. Someone had held her face and worked deliberately. She had no name either. Australia now had 2 nameless victims, a woman under the pines in New South Wales, a child in the Mallee in South Australia, and, for several months, no reason on earth to connect them. South Australian police made a decision that decided the case. They could not release a face. There was no face left to reconstruct, and even if there had been, a 2-year-old's features changed too fast to be recognizable years later. So they released the contents of the suitcase, photographs of the clothing, the tutu, the little dresses, and a quilt, handmade, patchwork, not a commercial design, an arrangement somebody had worked out themselves, panel by panel, stitched at a kitchen table. Police put that image on every news bulletin in the country and asked one question. Does anyone recognize this blanket? It was an unusual appeal, and it worked in an unusual way. A photograph of a child is passive. You look at it and either recognize the face or you don't. A photograph of a hand-sewn object is active. It asks the viewer to remember making something. It asks families to think about their own aunts, their own grandmothers, their own front rooms. More than 1,200 calls came into Crime Stoppers. Most were nothing. Mistaken quilts, well-meaning guesses, old grief attaching itself to a new case. Then, in October, a caller said something specific. They believed the quilt had been sewn by a woman in Alice Springs. That woman had died of cancer in 2012. She had made it for her granddaughter, a little blonde girl named Candace, who had left the Northern Territory with her mother in 2008 and never come home. The family had been told the mother wanted no contact. The caller offered a name for the child in the suitcase and a name for the mother nobody had been looking for. DNA moved fast after that. Relatives provided samples. On October 20th, 2015, the remains in the suitcase were confirmed as Candace Kiara Pierce, aged 2.5 at death. That confirmation raised the obvious question. Where was her mother? Investigators went looking for Carly Pierce Stevenson's DNA and found it in an unexpected place. Old medical records held a blood sample taken years earlier, before she ever left Alice Springs. They ran it against the National Database of Unidentified Remains. On October 21st, 2015, one day after the child was named, the Angel of Belanglo was named as well. The woman under the pines was the mother of the girl in the suitcase. 2 cases, 2 states, 5 years apart, closed within 24 hours of each other by a blanket. The joint investigation that followed did not take long, because the answer had been sitting in plain sight since 2008. There was one person who had left Alice Springs with them, one person who had been using Carly's phone, one person whose fingerprints were all over $72,000 of withdrawals from a dead woman's account. On the 28th of October 2015, a week after the identifications, police arrested Daniel James Holdom at Cessnock in the New South Wales Hunter Valley and charged him with the murder of Carly Pierce Stevenson. He was 41. On the 15th of December, after South Australian and New South Wales detectives had pooled the phone data, the financial trail, and the witness accounts, he was charged with the murder of Candace as well. Then, investigators searched what he had kept. They found the photographs. Holdom fought it for nearly 3 years. He denied both killings. He offered alternative accounts. He blamed others. He waited while the Crown assembled phone tower data, financial records, the testimony of Hazel Passmore under her immunity arrangement, and the images he had never been able to bring himself to delete. On July 31st, 2018, 1 week before his trial was due to begin, he pleaded guilty to both murders. Sentencing came on the 30th of November 2018 in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. The courtroom was full. Justice Robert Allen Hume found the crimes to be of very grave heinousness. Of Carly, he said Holdom had shown complete disdain for her existence as a human being. That to him, she had been flesh with a life that could be extinguished for his own pleasure. He described the photographs as a trophy of the man's inhumanity. He noted the cruelty of what followed, the messages sent to a mother who was dying, the fraud committed against a daughter who no longer existed. Of Candace, he used one word: despicable. A completely defenseless child, killed 4 days after her mother, by a man who accepted he had intended to assault her. Holdom attempted, that morning, to withdraw his guilty plea to the child's murder. The application was refused after a brief adjournment. 2 life sentences, no parole. He will die in prison. His subsequent appeal, arguing the sentences were excessive, changed nothing about that. The public gallery applauded. Scott Povey had already told the court what the case had cost, that his wife spent her last years believing her daughter had abandoned her, and asked, hours before she died, whether Carly and Candace had arrived yet. Carly and her daughter were returned to Alice Springs and buried together near Colleen. Every institution designed to notice a missing person failed here. A police report was closed by a text message. A national appeal with a reconstructed face produced nothing. 5 years of forensic work could not put a name to a skeleton. What finally broke it was a woman at a kitchen table in the desert, stitching a blanket for a granddaughter who had no idea she was making the only evidence that would ever matter. Holdom threw it in the suitcase because it was rubbish. It was the thing that named them both. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.